Hi there, and welcome back to the Modern Recruiter podcast. I'm Shannon Castleman, Senior Manager of Global Talent Acquisition here at Greenhouse. Today, we're talking about what's arguably the most transformative technology to hit hiring, AI interview screeners. Here at Greenhouse, we recently began using Voice AI, which is our conversational AI interviewing technology, to give candidates an additional opportunity to share their experience in their own words beyond their resume. It also gives recruiters time back to work on deepening candidate relationships, hiring manager relationships, and more strategic work as well. My guest today is Jordan Singer. She's a Senior Director of Talent Acquisition at Clover Health, and her team adopted Voice AI earlier this year. So Jordan, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Great. So before we get into any of the juicy AI stuff, I would love if you could just tell me a little bit more about Clover Health, your team structure, and maybe even the types of roles you all recruit for.
I lead recruiting at Clover Health. We're a healthcare technology company focused on improving care for people on Medicare. And at the heart of what we do is an AI-powered platform called Counterpart Assistant that helps physicians make better informed decisions at the point of care. And because we operate at this really interesting intersection of healthcare, technology, and insurance, we really get to recruit for a very interesting mix of roles across the business. Also, our workforce is global, but we predominantly recruit for positions in North America, mostly the United States and Canada. And honestly, we have a really lean team considering the volume and complexity of hiring we support. We have about 10 recruiters plus an ops team. So we really don't have the luxury of being a large team that can spend all day screening candidates and handling a large volume of recs. So when I think about recruiter capacity, it's something that we have to be very intentional about.
Got it. That makes complete sense. And I feel like it's a struggle that a lot of teams have with lean teams and lots of recruiting to do. So I appreciate you sort of setting the stage there for us on that. You did tell me on our prep call that your team didn't necessarily go looking for Voice AI, but you more so, hit a little bit of a breaking point. So tell me a little bit more about what was happening.
Yeah, I don't know if there was one single moment, and I know we're not alone in this, but we mostly started seeing the same problem everywhere. Like we'd open a role and we'd get flooded with hundreds or even thousands of applications. And sometimes we'd have to take the posting down after a couple of days just to stop the flow, the onslaught. Other times we knew that there were candidates sitting in the system who a recruiter realistically was never going to get to. And then when recruiters did start talking to candidates, they were increasingly talking to or asking themselves, is this person real? Are these actually their skills? Are they being assisted by AI right now? So at that point, it became pretty clear that we needed to find a solution. So I didn't start with how can we use AI in recruiting? I would say we started with we have more candidates than humans can reasonably evaluate, and the signals we've traditionally relied on are becoming less reliable. So how do we solve that?
Yeah, and to honestly back up that statement, we have some data here at Greenhouse that there's been an 111% increase in applications per job. And because of that, about 93% of applications never make it to an interview. So completely backs up everything that your team is feeling and what you're saying. I'm curious, how did you all land on Voice AI rather than just deciding to add more recruiting team members or maybe more screening steps to your process?
Yeah, I'd say the timing was really interesting. Voice AI was starting to take off around the same time. And internally, there was this really strong push for us to think about where AI could genuinely make us better operators. I'm sure a lot of companies have some sort of AI initiatives internally, and we're certainly one of those as well. So rather than immediately saying, okay, we have more volume, we need more recruiters, it felt like the right moment to ask whether new technology could fundamentally change the way we handled the top of funnel. And what intrigued us was that it potentially solved two problems at once. Obviously, there is the scalability case, which we talked about, but there's also this somewhat counterintuitive idea that AI could make the process more human. When you have thousands of applicants, a candidate can really easily become a resume in a large pile, like what you just mentioned with your stats. So the thought was, what if we give someone 10 or 15 minutes to actually tell us who they are and what they've done? It serves as another signal as opposed to just going off of their resume, and it really gives them an opportunity to stand out. But I will say we're early. We've been piloting it since the beginning of this year. So we're very much in this phase of testing hypotheses and looking at data rather than declaring, we've figured it all out.
And hey, you're a little bit farther along than our team. We started piloting it in June. So as someone who has been, using this technology a little bit longer than we have, I'm curious, where in the process have you found the most success using voice AI? Like, is it right at the application stage? Is it sort of like replacing the recruiter screen? Would love to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so we use it before the recruiter stage. I think of it as a supplemental application step. So how it's currently structured for the roles that we're using it on, we have an applicant pool. We'll review that applicant pool to a certain extent and identify a short list. And then we'll invite those candidates to complete the voice AI conversation from there. And then it goes into the recruiter screen stage. So we will look at the results from the voice AI interview. We'll look at their resume and use both of those things as context to decide whether they should move to a recruiter screen stage. So we haven't used AI to replace any existing interview stages. I want to make that clear. We're using it more as a method to get a richer set of information at a point where we've historically only relied on resumes to provide that. Another way to think about it is, how can we use voice AI to help us understand a large candidate pool more deeply before deciding where to invest human time? Also, it means when we do get on the phone with that person, we already know a lot about them. And it makes the experience more human in a way when you already know a bit about their experience and capabilities prior to that first connection point.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that. We're currently utilizing it in a similar stage in a way that you are, but I know that there's other companies like I know Zapier uses voice AI as well, and they're having it where every application receives a link to use voice AI. And so I think there's clearly multiple ways to be successful with it at the top of the process. But either way, it gives the candidates that opportunity to be more than just their resume and share more of their skills and experience besides just where they worked and how long. What did you really feel like was different for your recruiters once this was live on your team?
The biggest difference is going to be really where recruiters could spend their time. The goal is to give the not human work to AI so recruiters have more capacity for the work that really benefits from human building, like building relationships. Think about, talking about Clover, discussing team and culture, answering questions, obviously discernment, judgment, the things that are truly human. But I will note, we also learned that the work doesn't just disappear. Some of it shifts upstream. So recruiters now need to configure the technology, evaluate its performance, make sure it's producing the outcomes they want. So it has the capacity to be an important shift in the recruiter role. You're not just managing a pipeline, you're managing the technology that's helping you run it. So I just want to be clear, there is an upfront time investment, but when it's set up and managed well, the leverage is really significant.
How much time does that setup and calibration actually take?
It's really going to vary. And it varies by role. I mean, when you have a new position, one that you haven't recruited for before, it's not an evergreen position, it's maybe not even a high volume position, you need to spend more time calibrating. So when we first implemented voice AI, one of the things that was really important to us is that we run a very similar process. So we would do what I said earlier, where we have a short list, we invite candidates to participate in the voice AI interview. And then I was doing this myself, so I can speak firsthand on this. I was actually doing recruiter screens for almost all of those that completed the voice AI interview because I wanted to compare my thoughts, my experience assessing those candidates with what the voice AI was producing as well and compare and contrast. And it told me whether I needed to recalibrate, whether I needed to provide more information, whether on the role, the rubric, etc., so that I was getting clearer responses that were more aligned with how I would assess those candidates as well. And that was an example using a position that we had never hired for before. But if you think about it from there, there's compounding effects. So if you're working on a high volume position or an evergreen role, or if you then have a similar role open in the same team or similar role on a different team, then you can start to reuse that information, or you have that upfront time investment, similar to doing an intake meeting, really understanding all of the requirements and responsibilities of the position. Once you set it up, then you're going to get it's going to be a lot more streamlined from there.
So that being said, what are the best types of roles do you feel like are the best use cases to use an AI screener on?
So after a brief initial pilot, we gave every recruiter access and we wanted to encourage them to experiment with it. So part of this strategy, we wanted to cast a wide net because we wanted feedback on both usability and where this technology was actually going to be most effective. And I'd say one of the biggest learnings is just because you can use AI for a role doesn't mean you should. And the value has been somewhat uneven across requisitions, and that's not a bad thing. I'd say that the clearest use case has been high volume roles, or roles where we're seeing more fraud or AI assisted candidates. We find a lot of these positions in our technical divisions or some of our data oriented searches. And that's where taking work out of the top of funnel can create much more meaningful leverage. Our internal review similarly identifies technical and high volume roles as the areas where we're seeing the most potential value. On the other hand, just to give a differing opinion, we tried it on some other one-off positions outside of our technical orgs. We tried it on a senior operational search, and we found that the role was a little too nuanced for it. We had a hard time designing questions and a rubric that gave us enough signal to meaningfully differentiate between candidates. Ultimately, we found it was creating more work without helping us narrow the funnel. So we've moved away from thinking, how do we use this everywhere toward where does this solve a meaningful problem? If the volume is manageable and recruiters aren't struggling to identify the right candidates, adding another piece of technology might just introduce unnecessary friction.
What did you underestimate about introducing AI into the recruiting process?
One really important lesson was that trust shouldn't mean blindly accepting the AI's output. This is not something that you can turn on and expect it to work perfectly out of the box. And I think a lot of people might be looking for this magic bullet solution to help with top of funnel issues. Our recruiters embraced it quickly, but I found that when they hit a roadblock, sometimes they reverted to the old way just because it's faster and familiar. And I've seen this with most new technology we've implemented. So this isn't anything that is unique to voice AI, I would say. We've learned to think about AI almost like a new employee. So you have to train it, right? You have to calibrate it. You have to inspect its work. You have to manage its performance. And that takes time, which is hard. We talked about one of the reasons why we were interested in this technology is because we needed to scale the team. So when we talk about things that take time, it's a difficult concept to wrap your head around. But once you make that investment, you get the leverage on the other side. So I'd say the biggest lesson here is that AI adoption is as much a change management challenge as it is a technology implementation.
I totally agree. And I think that stands true even outside of voice AI, like for any type of AI that your team or company is utilizing in their process. There needs to be that human oversight, that investment, that training it, that good input in is good input out, et cetera. So kind of switching gears to the candidate side of things, I have seen conflicting points of view from the candidate perspective on things like LinkedIn. I've seen where some candidates are actually really excited and would prefer even to talk to an AI interview screener than a person. It's less nerve-wracking for them. And then I've seen other candidates who are like, I would drop out of the process if it's an AI interview screener. Like, I want to speak to a human. So by opting in to an AI interview screener, what do you think is in it for the candidate?
When you compare it to the traditional application experience, when you think about submitting your resume and just waiting, it's not particularly candidate friendly either. I think this gives candidates the opportunity to show who they are beyond what's on the page. And we often talk about how a role that we're hiring for is so much more than a job description. We make a job description because we need something to physically post, but most people listening probably understand that once you're hired into that role, it changes a lot. And I think it's very similar for candidates too. You produce a resume, but it's a piece of paper, and there's so much more than that. So for candidates selected for an AI interview, it gives them another way to showcase their experience and skills. They don't need to rely on how polished their resume is. And now AI can make the same resume over and over again. It also takes away this concept of, you need to go to a certain school or you need to have worked for a recognizable company in order to get noticed via your resume. And as you were saying, and I think some candidates like the flexibility of AI interviews. I think there are a lot of practical benefits as well. It's fast. Most of our interviews last between 10 and 15 minutes. It's flexible, depending on what time of day you feel most on, you can do it whenever. The AI is always ready. And honestly, when the technology is set up well, it can feel much more like a real conversation than people might expect. And AI is smart. What we found is that it can ask really relevant follow-up questions based on what the candidate actually says rather than simply working through a static list. So we've seen a lot of really positive feedback in our post-interview surveys. And I'll also add anecdotally, some of the candidates I've spoken with later in the process, they told me how impressed they were by how specific and relevant the follow-up questions were during the voice AI interview. So I wouldn't claim that every candidate is going to prefer an AI interview to a human one, but I'd say compared with submitting a resume and waiting in a queue, I do think there's a very compelling candidate experience when this is used in the right place and used well.
I totally agree. We also had a similar experience where during our pilot, we were really pleasantly surprised that our candidate satisfaction score, like the survey they took at the end of the interview, was a 4.7 out of 5 on average. So candidates have had a really great experience with it. And I want to double click on something you said that I think is extremely important, which is in almost like the old way of recruiting, or the purpose that the resume served is like, where did you go to school? What companies did you work for how long? What was your title? And I think it sometimes creates a process where then the candidates who are being selected are the ones where the recruiter, maybe just unintentionally, recognizes that company name or that school name or that size. And there could be a better candidate for the role who maybe worked for a super small startup or a completely different industry or didn't go to school, and they're the best fit for the job. And so this gives them an opportunity to really talk through what's arguably more important than just your resume. It's like, what are your values? What are your skill sets? What's motivating you right now? It's really getting to the human versus just the resume itself. So I think for candidates, with how many applications we're getting, the alternative, like you mentioned, is either applying and maybe not hearing anything, or getting this extra opportunity to like really provide more value as to what you can bring to the table other than just where you've worked or where you went to school. So I actually think it's really exciting for candidates to be able to tell their story and be more than a resume.
Exactly.
I'm curious, there's nothing worse than when you are like on the phone calling a company and you realize after a little bit, you're like, I think I'm talking to a robot. Like, I don't actually think this is a real human. Hold on a second. So how do candidates find out that they are talking to an AI screener in your process?
I've read some of the articles out there and around skepticism around AI interviewing. One of the experiences that often comes up is what you just mentioned. Candidates are expecting to meet with a recruiter, a human recruiter, and only realizing when the interview starts that they're speaking with AI. We're extremely intentional about transparency. Candidates know before they participate that this is an AI interview. They know why we're using it, where it fits into our hiring process. They also know what types of roles are ripe for AI interviews. So there should never be a moment where someone thinks they're about to meet a recruiter and discovers it's an AI interviewer instead. That's a big no-no for us. We also really explain what I said earlier, that this is a supplemental application stage. So this doesn't guarantee that they're going to get a recruiter screen or meet with a human. This is an opportunity, again, for them to talk through their experience a little bit more with our AI interview platform. And that the information from the conversation is considered alongside their resume to help determine whether they progress to a recruiter screen. And we're also really clear about what the AI does and doesn't do. It provides additional information to our recruiting team, but it does not make any decisions. It doesn't make hiring decisions. It doesn't make decisions about whether or not they are going to progress. All of the decisions about the candidates are human made, human reviewed, and we make that abundantly clear. Candidates also have the ability to opt out. We believe if we're asking candidates to engage with a new technology, they should understand what they're agreeing to and have another path if they're not comfortable with it. And I'll say, and this is something that is more of a future statement, but this transparency requires AI literacy from our recruiters too. This is something that's really important to me and we're working on as well. And if a candidate asks why we're using AI or what happens with the interview or how the output factors into the process, recruiters need to be able to answer those questions or know the proper escalation paths if more clarity is needed. That responsibility can't live with one technical person behind the scenes.
I agree. I think it's like anything else in business, as long as there's communication and context. And really transparency, I think that's what a candidate needs to get behind a process and be bought in. And so I think it's really important that if companies are utilizing this type of technology, that they over-index on that context, the communication and the transparency, like you mentioned, you all are doing. What has been, some of your team's early learnings or biggest takeaways, now that you've been utilizing this technology for almost, 9 months now?
I'd say the biggest learning opportunity for us was treating it too much like a software you implement rather than something you manage. We found that some recruiters would turn it on and rely solely on the AI generated questions and rubric and just assume it was ready to go, almost a little too much trust that the AI was smarter than them. And we learned pretty quickly that the quality of the output is directly related to the quality of the setup, good data in, good data out. And ongoing calibration is incredibly important as well. So if we didn't invest up front, we were creating more work for ourselves in the back end. So we've had to coach recruiters to think about AI almost like an employee they're managing, which can be a hard thing to process. Again, you need to teach it what you're looking for, inspect its work, give it feedback, recalibrate. These are really important and critical things for it to be successful. So now we're putting in more structure, more accountability around that setup and calibration process rather than leaving each recruiter to figure it out independently. And I think that's changed how I think about the recruiter's job. I think using AI effectively is becoming a skill in itself. Recruiters don't need to be technologists, but they do need to know how to manage these tools well enough to get good outcomes from them.
Completely agree. We have AI fluency as a competency within our organization for every role, especially, of course, with recruiters too. And so speaking of AI fluency, I'm curious, drawing the line for me, where do you feel like voice AI or AI in general, what is it clearly better at versus what do you all believe should still purely sit with, the human within this process?
I'd say AI is particularly good at the consistent, repeatable work at scale. So early screening, gathering information, digging deeper into a candidate's experience without getting tired or varying the process from person to person. So again, at scale. One thing that surprised me was how good it could be in areas where I'm not a subject matter expert. Just a lot of roles that we work on. I often think about recruiters. We know a little bit about a lot because we usually have to work on so many different areas, so many parts of the company. So, the example that I was using earlier was a specialized strategic finance search. This was one of the early searches that we used when we were piloting it. And the voice AI could ask these really technical questions and then follow the candidate's answers with really specific follow-ups. And it could unpack their experience at a depth that I just personally couldn't have. So what then happened was that actually made my subsequent conversation with the candidate more human, not less. I didn't need to spend our time recreating the technical assessment. I could just jump into talking about Clover, team, culture, motivations, and I could answer the questions they actually wanted a person to answer. So that's really the line for me. Let AI do as much of the not human work as it can, so our people can spend more time on the work where being human actually matters. Again, building relationships, selling the opportunity, understanding candidate motivations, and navigating all the nuance that comes with recruiting. And then of course, ultimately, people need to make decisions. So AI can gather information, surface signals, help filter those really large funnels, but we don't have it automatically rejecting candidates or making any sort of decision.
Love the example you brought up, because I know earlier we talked a little bit about what roles voice AI is really great for. We mentioned high volume sales roles. We mentioned, acting as another like Swiss cheese layer for candidate fraud defense, for technical recruiting. And then I love this third example, which is like, what you mentioned, roles where maybe the recruiter isn't an expert because they don't hire for it that often, or it comes up every once in a blue moon, or it's very niche and new. Like recruiters, depending on the company, are filling anywhere from 20 to 80, maybe less or more, depending on, your industry and setup, roles a year. There's no way you can be a complete expert, start to finish, and exactly what that person is doing, the technology they use, the jargon. And so that is a great use case for AI to come in and kind of supplement some of those gaps. And I think it's a cool use case for the candidate too, to really feel like, the person on the other end, or robot on the other end, is understanding their answers and responses in a technical way, which I think is great. So completing an AI screener, as you mentioned within your own process, same with ours, is completely optional for candidates, and it doesn't affect their candidacy at all if they don't complete it. But I'm curious, like, what do you think would be reasons why maybe a candidate wouldn't complete an AI screener?
Right now, we're really careful not to overinterpret it. We know that introducing an additional step naturally is going to narrow the funnel, but non-completion can happen for a lot of reasons. I'd say some may no longer be interested. They might not remember applying. They may have applied really broadly, or simply just might not want to participate in an AI interview, as you had noted previously. We shouldn't assume those candidates are unqualified or fraudulent. We do have a hypothesis that some portion of the drop-off could be candidates who mass applied or weren't genuinely interested in the specific opportunity, and potentially some fraudulent applicants, but we don't have the data today to prove that. So I guess I would view non-completion as a funnel signal we want to understand, not a candidate quality signal at this stage. And that distinction is really important. And because they can opt out and continue through our standard process, declining the AI experience itself isn't something we treat as a negative signal.
I think that that's a really important distinction. And look, like, I've been there myself, where I've been on the phone with a customer service representative. I'm like, representative, so I'm guilty of that as someone who considers themselves very AI forward and leaning. Like, that's okay to opt out. And again, another candidate advantage, if you are like, it does, there might be a reason why a candidate doesn't complete it if they aren't looking any longer. This isn't the role for them, or they already got another job. And then that's good news for the candidates who are still actively engaged. So, their application can stand out as well. I'm curious. So one of the new frontier questions that TA leaders might ask themselves when implementing any new technology or efficiency, but especially with this, is like, okay, so what's the impact or success metric goal? Like, if I implement something like a voice AI, at the end of the day, what am I looking to get out of it? Or what does success look like? And I'm curious, what gains either you've already seen, or like maybe even a future state of what you're hoping to accomplish with this technology.
Yeah. And again, we're still early on. So a lot of these are hypotheses, but agree. Anytime you implement something new, especially something robust like voice AI, you need to have a hypothesis, at least a set of hypotheses on what you're expecting to achieve or what outcomes you expect. So I would say the core business hypothesis is pretty simple. Can we reduce the number of recruiter screens it takes to identify a great candidate? If we can, that should translate into great recruiter capacity and allow us to scale hiring without adding recruiting headcount at the same rate. And there's an added benefit of recruiters are generally happier when they're doing less upfront work and can still get those quality outcomes of finding great candidates. And, on that note too, this is harder to measure, but is important and I'd really like to measure, and that's around quality. When you have 1,000 applicants, there are almost certainly qualified people buried in that pool who a recruiter's just never going to get to. Like your stats from earlier. So how can AI help us identify and ultimately hire, hopefully, great candidates who under our old process realistically would have gone stale in the queue? I'd say that's harder to quantify though, because you're essentially trying to measure a counterfactual, but it could be one of the most meaningful measures of success. So hopefully we or someone out there can figure out a great way to measure this over time. Where I'm cautious is claiming time savings too early. Voice AI estimates, interviews completed so far represent a pretty significant amount of hours of recruiter time saved. But that's a gross estimate. And a lot of what we talked about earlier today, it doesn't account for the time recruiters are spending setting up the interview, that upfront time, that calibration time. It doesn't account for following up with candidates or conducting subsequent screens. I do think that there are significant time savings. It's just a harder formula to parse out right now. And then, of course, on a new role, I wouldn't expect the early numbers to immediately prove the ROI. Again, these are going to take a lot more time to calibrate on, and you may need to be more intentional when you're reviewing interviews and moving candidates forward.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I'll also continue to say the disclaimer you did, which is we're very early on in this. We just started a couple months ago. Something I was excited to see, which isn't necessarily the success metric we're hanging our hat on, but most of our recruiters have reported a 50% reduction in screen time. So they do a recruiter touch base after the voice AI. And whereas a typical recruiter screen could be anywhere from like 30 to 45 minutes, these check-in calls are much shorter at like 15 minutes. And so that's been a big win for us. But I agree with you. Like, there's a lot of different ways you could probably slice and dice this. And I think what's hard is like a lot of times with AI, the immediate first thing we think of is like time savings or like cost savings, because that's like the most immediate impact to the business. But when we think of like even just the force multiplication aspect of AI, I like some of the examples you brought up, which are harder to measure. But did we hire that candidate whose resume without voice AI, we might have just completely looked over, or it might have gotten lost in the shuffle? I think that would be so cool to see, is something like that. I also think even potentially like doing more screens, like maybe a recruiter who's a human only has the capacity to do anywhere from 15 to 40 screens for a rec, right? Because they have other recs they need to work. But now we can interview hundreds of candidates, or if the recruiter's out on PTO or like there's a time zone difference, that role keeps moving. And so maybe it's a time to fill metric. So I think there's a lot of different ways that you can look at it where it can have an impact that's not even just necessarily like reducing time or cost, et cetera. Great. Okay. Well, the final note I want to ask is, if someone is listening in TA who has a similar problem as you mentioned, or a lot of us experience, like a lean team, a rising volume of recs, a budget that just unfortunately isn't growing, what do you tell them?
I know those feelings all too well. I'd say start with the problem, not the technology. What I was saying in the beginning of today's conversation, this was really important to us. We had identified a problem that ultimately we solved with technology. Find the roles where your team is genuinely hitting a capacity constraint, whether it's high applicant volume, significant fraud, repetitive screening. Don't deploy AI across every role simply because you can, but also be really clear about ownership. Someone really has to be responsible for setting the tool up and calibrating it, monitoring the output, et cetera. This isn't a software where you just switch it on and forget about it. And I would say bring candidates along with you. We talked about this earlier. This is really important, when you're setting up this new tool. And, if you do decide to move forward with voice AI, you have to be very transparent about how you're using it. Don't judge the experiment too quickly. Early data might not look impressive, or it might look overly impressive, but you still need to learn and calibrate. And you should be defining upfront what success should eventually look like. Again, capacity, like what we were just talking about, quality, or candidate experience, and then give yourself enough time to actually test it.
I love it. Well, Jordan, thank you so much for this conversation today. I found a lot of these insights very, very valuable. I'm sure other TA leaders will as well. So why don't you tell us where people can find you if they want to connect or learn more?
Yeah, thanks. I'd love to connect on LinkedIn.
Great. All right. Well, that is the Modern Recruiter. If this was useful, follow the show wherever you listen and share it with someone on your team weighing the same types of decisions. I'm Shannon Castleman, and we will see you next time.